Okay, so today I'm going to talk about VR research like I did last year, but I'm going to talk about some of the things we couldn't answer, at least in our initial meeting of the VR Core, and I'll talk a little bit about myself. So I'm starting with this picture when Brennan and I went to Barcelona, and that was a turning point for me. I've been reading some of Mel's work for last 2 years, just racking my brain about virtual embodiment. And I would say part of my career now is chasing immersion. I find immersion every day, but the time length of being immersed and the effects of immersion, maybe minutes to seconds to minutes at a time, I know I'm physiologically or cognitively immersed. But the effect of being embodied in a domestic violence program and feeling that personal, being personally assaulted, that feeling lasted for hours, maybe up to 8 hours. And although I don't recommend, day-to-day person, this is something that's used for criminals actually in Barcelona. The knowledge that something could affect me for hours after and have long-term impact, that's definitely part of the future. So talking about the VR Core, we talked about essentially three things that came up and solidified into a guideline. And so there's VR1, VR2, VR3, and essentially the biggest the unique part of all this was a VR1, working with the patient, building out what are their thoughts, feelings, emotions about something, even before you've built the intervention. Now that is unique. Every startup here probably had an idea and then got feedback. We believe that getting it early and in the process of research will save you time and money and be much better designed. Now, of course, there's a lot of different ways to go about this. There's not as many publications on it as there should be, and we'll probably have more to come from our group of international researchers. VR2 has done, I think, pretty well. Of all the literature I've read in PubMed, probably 2/3 are these acceptability, tolerability studies. Maybe 1/3 is randomized controlled trials. And I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that we're running, quite large, fairly higher on the end of large studies for VR, for randomized controlled trials. So I'm going to go over just a couple questions today that the VR Core talked about and said, man, this is hard as a clinician. I'm having a hard time with this. And the first one is working with developers. What was brought up in our talks now back 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, we got to get the band back together. But we talked about working with developers. What's that language? What's that terminology? Am I going to have to learn code? Because these providers, you're not going to catch them coding. They're just wanting to finish their notes to go home to see their kids to bed, right? So there is a book that we recommended within our paper that I was the first author on, and it's a fantastic textbook. It will cover everything topics that if you read the whole thing, you probably could go up to a developer and say, oh yes, I want to work on this process, and oh, there's some jittering, and they'll go, oh God, you know what jittering is? So there is some terms, but I actually think I want to take it a step forward because I didn't read this book until a year and a half in to me developing programs with developers, or I should say it was more on the design side. So I just want to talk about a mentality I carry every day. In 10 years, there's going to be so much information. I know I'll never know everything about VR or any of the XRs that are going to come out here, but I will feel better about finding the people I need to be able to build it. So I would say this to every person: you got to find your people, and it's going to happen probably in 3 places, right? So lucky enough, there's a conference for virtual medicine, and you can find your people, you can find exhibitors, and you need that because if you already have built something at scale, I'm going to tell you this right now as like a DIY type person building stuff in his bedroom, that's not scaling. So even if something's efficacious, it probably is good to collaborate at a larger scale. But because I like DIY and I like building things, you'll see that soon. Meetup groups are fantastic. That's how I started. And there's one here in town that I'm a part of, and I try to give some talks to every now and then. The last one's hackathons. There's one coming up in April in town, April 12th. Hackathons, for me, I'm essentially have several relationships with developers, and really you find out quickly who you work best with, and you make great friends, and it's a high-pressure situation. Raphael saw me there. We'll talk a little bit of that in a second. So now you'll get to see what I do in my free time. Okay, so this page is my technical collaborators that I've worked with over the last 3 years. And it's really a thank you page because I think providers we get a lot of the thanks for doing it. And we're working hard, but if it was how many physicians does it take to put in a light bulb or make a VR program, it's way too many. So we'll start off with the top. John and Bob, back when I started, I will tell you a few tips and tricks that I've learned. You start with literature. So we actually worked with dental anxiety in the beginning. Thankfully, 3 years ago, there was only 15 publications for dental anxiety for using a head-mounted display. So I try to look at that first to come up with the idea, find where pilot study could be done, and think about your study design based on what was already in the literature. So we worked together and talked about something I'll talk about in a second called non-immersive VR. Almost all the dental anxiety research is non-immersive because you can't move your head when a dentist has instruments in your mouth. So it's a certain select type of program. And actually for me, working in the beginning, this was very easy for programmers that I worked with to develop. So it was a great starting point for me into this world of the metaverse. The next one, Ed Swan, man, this guy is brilliant. He's been working on augmented reality since back in the Navy in the 70s with heads-up displays on jet pilots. And I cold emailed him one day because I was reading about HoloLens through a few literature kind of review papers, and I was very curious about its ability to have image overlap. So I spent time in radiation oncology for a few years, and image overlap is pretty important when you're putting radiation to someone's body. And so I wanted to see what would be, how could we measure that in the HoloLens. So what we did was he flew up and saw me during my intern year, and on a Saturday, we hashed out a project. And I will say this, what I learned from this experience working with Ed, and I've called him a few times since then, but he only saw me one day. You will save so much time, even if you read all the literature. If you talk to Skip for like 15 minutes, or Walter, or anyone else, they will have thought about questions for the last 20 years that you go, oh my God, I would have spent a month trying to figure that out. So anyways, I CT scanned a bunch of boxes, and I mailed them to Ed down to his master's students. And we did do measurement studies for the HoloLens. And needless to say, it's challenging because the head moves more than we predicted. So still a lot to work to be done where that could actually be due for procedure guidance, but there are startups working on that. And Cinti AR was one of them that was here yesterday, Jennifer Silva. My next one, when I got further into radiation oncology, was working and partnering with academics, again with a master's student, Sophia, John, and Chris. And at that time, read the literature again for patient education in VR. I'm lucky, right? There's not a lot of literature here, right? So I can read 20, 30 papers total on a topic and get an understanding. So luckily, radiation oncology is complicated enough that they have done VR simulations, particularly for breast cancer. So I'll show you just some pictures of the demo that we made. Essentially, what we've said was, you need to be able to show where the radiation is going to go, show it going through the body, and you can't just take someone and bring them into the radiation treatment room and show them beforehand because, well, radiation's kind of you don't want to just be in it for the fun of it, right? You've got to show them essentially day of. So how do you do that beforehand, and how do you do it in a cost-effective way? And so we had some fun with the green screen, and essentially I took like 300 pictures of the room one day, and then we mapped it all out. And now we got a grant for $40,000 to run that. They're running that up in Wisconsin right now. The last one, first hackathon I went to, met some friends who are actually in the audience, had a great time at MIT at the virtually reality hackathon, met some people that I'm working on right now, again on a project for radiation oncology. I can't actually disclose today what we're working on, but it gives you a reason to come to VMed 2020. The plug. So this right here, this is it. So my mentality that I have every time I work with a technical collaborator, on whatever project I end up on, it's essentially a thought of trust and flexibility. Trust that they're going to do their part. They're not going to do a central line. They're not going to treat cancer. But what are they going to do? If there's a debugging issue, I'm not going to probably do the debugging. They're going to do the debugging, right? We're going to collaborate together. But you also have to have flexibility. What's in your brain might take 3 dedicated graphics card using ray tracing, right? That's not point A to point B. You've got to start slow, right? Prototype on something easy. And your job is to take everything from the patients, from the literature, from the clinical experience, and bring that to the creative process. And you'll have a ton of fun. I'm telling you what, it really is an absolute blast. So another thought I've had since we started the VR core was controls. And I really get excited about this because I think it is somewhat unique to VR about how do you do placebo VR or sham VR, right? So we talked about this. I love what the recommendations that we have in the paper, which is it's really dependent on your patient population. Sometimes you can't be doing controls, or active control. But if you can, it depends on the mechanism, depends on the setting, and what type you can. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about something that I've worked on, again, the first program I ever worked on, which was non-immersive VR in a headset. And talk about it from the immersion spectrum, right? So essentially, there's a lot of different options, but essentially what I'm saying is that there's a 2D picture, there's 2D video, there's 360 degree, there's seated VR, 3DOF, there's 6DOF with motion tracking, and you can do some pretty crazy things like you've seen with Mel Slater's work. And we predict there's probably going to be a clinical impact if you're looking at it for a specific indication. So you need to isolate immersion. That's the software side. You also need to isolate, I think, the novelty of the headset. That is debated within the VR core. What I'm saying is not dogma or canon, but it is something I think that the novelty of the headset may have an effect. So essentially, there were a couple options as we were building this with dental patients. First is the thing you see in the back is a skybox. So that's the clouds. There's commercial void theaters out there, but they're all black, and patients were telling us that I don't really want to be in the dark when I'm watching this 80-inch screen TV in Unity. Well, they didn't say Unity, but you know what I'm talking about, inside the program. And so then we have it to where you can actually pull up the TV using relaxation videos that we used during the pilots. And then, this carpet that I'm standing on, a lot of patients said they wanted to be actually to see their outside world, communicate with their providers. This could actually be helpful because some of my colleagues with the VR core will debate whether even being in a skybox, which is pretty much a sky, there's not a whole lot to it, that even that's immersive. So again, trying to isolate it, you can essentially turn it into a Google Glass, which we wouldn't ever say is immersive, but it has utility. And just like that, sham VR has utility for VR3, randomized controlled trials. And there's literature to support this. So 2009, Hunter Hoffman did a great study. Small, but understandably, those were expensive times back then. Headsets were just expensive and heavy. But they showed a significant reduction beyond their control. And the control was they'd had a recording that went on rails of that program. You could interact with it versus one you could. This is actually pretty easy for app developers to have a recording within Unity or Unreal of their demo and have that if they were working with someone who's doing a clinical trial, they requested it. So the last one's unmet needs. And these are needs that we don't have exact answers to, but they are challenges that we are thinking about. So the first one is probably more from within the VR core. I'm speaking more about the academic VRs that are actually developing. So a lot of the ones that were like Diane from yesterday, fantastic work. But one of the things, and Kate also, they make great things that they want to experiment within their group, but they're concerned. It's actually kind of like a good problem to have that the consumer VR is getting so good. What if their patients go, oh, what you have here? I don't even see any like high-end shader or particle effects. Like, come on now. In truth, this is a theoretical concern from the research department, and I think we'll definitely see tests of this. And I don't know if clinically there will be a difference, because it could be once you're immersed, it's more of it's a subconscious level. Whether you have enough, polygons on the screen may not be imperative, but we'll see in the future. So the other challenge, this came up probably the most. If you were to ask, what's the number one challenge everyone talks about? The speed of technology. Conservatively, what would you think? 6 months? That would be conservative, right? I feel like every 6 months there's a new headset. There's got to be, right? And in the last 6 months, we've probably had 9? I don't know. It's a lot. It's a lot of headsets in the last year. And so they're concerned about the speed of this technology. And for all the, clinical trial groups in the audience, when you're building something from protocol to the end, who has had a new headset and go, oh darn, I hope that new headset is that critical, But that's actually not the full question. The full question that's the real challenge is speed of traditional randomized control trials. So randomized control trials traditionally can take years to finish, a large one, right? So there's many reasons why it will take years. And that's because of enrollment rates are challenging. Specific locations are hard to bring an intervention in. If you come in and you have a 6-year-old patient and I have something that looks like this giant futuristic lunchbox, it's going to go onto their face and they've got a 15-minute appointment, I've got a little bit of pressure under me to say, okay, they're going to have that appointment, I'm going to go talk to them, and then they're going to get to parking. And so there's a lot of challenges within all that we're working on. But we definitely have to bring that 24 months down to closer to the 6 months, because otherwise we won't necessarily always catch up to the technology. Not that maybe we necessarily have to try to attempt that. The other thing is the cost of running a randomized control trial is quite challenging. We've talked to multiple hospitals now that are interested in working with us, up to 8 of them. And one of my, if you said, like, what's on your bucket list? One of my bucket lists is to see a 1,000-person study sooner than later. And right now, if I was to average out all the randomized control trials that have been done, and our lab's done several reviews, I've done reviews, that it's probably somewhere between 90 and 180 patients for randomized control trials. So 1,000's that's not bad, so, order of magnitude higher. But the cost goes up considerably when you start to consider multiple centers. I'm sure you all know that cost of healthcare in the US is expensive, and that translates also for research. So this is a paper I really highly recommend in 2016 that talked about pragmatic clinical trials. And it's actually from cardiology, and they talk about this using portals to actually collect data and have registries. And so registries are being formed. Corey has a registry that they've built out, and it's something that using these digital interfaces will help with a lot of the challenges that we have for a VR3. And what I think about when I see a pharmaceutical drug, I go, darn, as soon as that goes into their stomach, it can't fill out an Excel sheet. It can't do anything other than just that drug. Of course, I'm thinking about it from a digital perspective, but to some degree, all of this digital technology that we use can help streamline the process. I also use a key word here. I use sightless, and that's actually pretty important as well, because being able to do this remotely will be key probably to the future. We're right now working with one of our studies to be able to do remote consenting, remote enrollment, and to be able to, this can't be done with all therapeutic programs, but certain programs that can be done at the home, this is something that might help significantly with doing a randomized controlled trial. So that's essentially it for my talk. We're just talking about some of the challenges, and hopefully next year we'll have more on the solutions published. That's what we're going to have. So yeah, thanks so much.